The land in that part of Colorado, in the year of 1882, was a hard testament. It was made of red clay that clung to a man's boots like a needy sin, and rock that broke the tips of plows. The wind that came down from the mountains had a high, lonesome sound, and carried the cold even in late spring. It was a landscape that offered no easy comfort. It demanded respect, paid in sweat and silence. Silas understood this kind of country. He was 41, but the years had marked him harder than most. He was a lean man, all bone and sinew, with a face weathered to the color of old leather. His hands were competent, the knuckles raw and scarred from a life of work that asked everything and gave just enough to get by. He rode a dun horse that was as spare and enduring as he was, and all he owned was in his saddlebags. He had been a husband, he had been a father. Now he was just a man in motion, looking for a place to stop, though he had long forgotten what stillness felt like. The road he followed was less a road and more a suggestion, a pair of ruts that wound through pinon and juniper. It led him to a ranch tucked into a shallow valley, a place that looked as tired as he felt. The main house was built of graying timber, its spine sagging in the middle. The corrals had a lean to them, as if they were tired of standing. A length of fence along the road was down, the wire coiled like a dead snake in the dust. It was a place holding on by memory alone. He saw the sign nailed to a fence post, the letters faded but clear enough. Hand wanted. It was not a promise, it was a plea. Silas had seen a dozen such signs in the last 100 miles. He had ridden past all of them. But something about the quiet desperation of this place, the sheer honesty of its decay, made him pull the dun to a halt. The wind moved through the dry grass, and it sounded like a sigh. He was tired of riding. He was tired of the silence that lived inside him, a silence so thick it pressed against him like a second skin. Maybe a few weeks of hard labor would be a different kind of quiet. A man came out of the barn. He was old, his back bent into a permanent question mark. He moved with the slow, deliberate shuffle of a man whose joints had turned to rust. He squinted at Silas, his eyes a pale, washed-out blue. "Looking for work?" the old man asked. His voice was thin, frayed at the edges. "Saw your sign," Silas said. It was all the explanation needed. "Name's Abel. This is my place. Or what's left of it." He gestured vaguely at the tired buildings. Not much to offer. Found and 20 a month. It was low, even for a place like this. But Silas hadn't come for the money. He had come for the fence post with the sign on it. He had come for the stopping. "I'm Silas." He dismounted. The motion was fluid, economical. He had been on a horse so long it felt more natural than walking. "Well, Silas," Abel said, a flicker of something like relief in his pale eyes. "The work's waiting." It was then that Silas saw her. She came from the side of the house, carrying a bucket of water in each hand. She was tall, taller than most women he knew, with a frame that was all straight lines and quiet purpose. Her hair was the color of sun-bleached wheat, pulled back from a face that was serious and plain, yet possessed a kind of stark clarity. Her eyes, he noticed, were a deep, steady gray. They were taking stock eyes. They saw the worn leather of his coat, the dust on his boots, the weariness in his posture, and filed it all away without judgment. She walked with a pronounced limp. Her left leg dragged slightly, forcing a roll into her otherwise steady gait. It was an old injury, he could tell. One she had learned to live with, to work around, until it was as much a part of her as the color of her eyes. The buckets of water didn't sway. She carried the weight with an uncomplaining strength that seemed centered deep within her. Abel saw him watching. "That's my Alara," he said, his voice softening. "My daughter." She reached the porch and set the buckets down with a quiet thud. She looked from her father to Silas, her expression unreadable. "This is Silas," Abel said. "He's staying on for a bit." Alara nodded once, a simple, declarative gesture. She did not offer a smile or a word of welcome. She simply acknowledged his presence, another fact in a day filled with them. Then she picked up the buckets and disappeared inside the house, the screen door sighing shut behind her. The limp was more noticeable on the steps, a brief faltering in her rhythm. Silas unsaddled the dun and turned him into the nearest corral. The gate groaned on its hinges. He looked around. The place needed more than one man. It needed a new beginning. The windmill's blades were still, one of them bent. The water trough had a slow, steady leak that had turned the ground around it into a dark patch of mud. The barn roof was missing shingles, leaving dark, vulnerable squares open to the sky. He had meant to stay a week, maybe 2, just long enough to quiet the ghosts that rode with him. He had no intention of mending more than a patch of fence and moving on. He was a man who moved on. It was all he knew how to do anymore. The first few days established a rhythm. It was a rhythm of work, dictated by the sun and the endless list of things that were broken. Silas started with the fence along the road, digging new post holes in the unforgiving clay, stretching the wire until it hummed with tension. Abel worked alongside him when he could, but his strength was a flickering candle against the wind. He would work for an hour, then have to sit, his breathing ragged. It was Alara who was the constant. She was up before the sun, her quiet movements in the house the first sound of the day. She cooked, she cleaned, she tended a small garden behind the house with a fierce devotion. But her work did not end at the door. Silas saw her in the barn, mending harnesses with a skill that surprised him. Her stitches were small and even. Her hands, though chapped and work-worn, moved with a surgeon's precision. She knew the animals, their moods and their needs. She moved among the cattle with a quiet confidence that soothed them. Her limp was always there, a constant, uneven beat against the rhythm of the ranch. Silas noticed how the other hand, a boy of no more than 17 named Charlie, would sometimes watch her with a look of pity or worse, dismissal. Charlie was lazy, always finding the shady spot to rest, his work done with a carelessness that bordered on insult. Yet he walked straight. One afternoon, Silas was replacing a rotten plank in the corral when he saw Charlie trying to corner a young filly that had gotten spooked. The boy was loud and clumsy, waving his arms, only making the horse more frantic. The filly reared, her eyes wide with fear, and lashed out with her hooves. Alara came out of the barn. She didn't shout, she didn't run. She walked toward the panicked horse, her pace steady, her limp a quiet, persistent beat. She was speaking to the animal in a low, calm voice, a stream of nonsense syllables that was more about tone than words. The filly's ears twitched. Her panicked movements began to slow. Alara kept walking, kept talking, her hand outstretched. She did not look at the horse's eyes, but at its shoulder, a gesture of non-aggression. Slowly the filly quieted. Her sides were heaving, but the wild fear was gone. Alara reached her and laid a hand on her neck, stroking the damp hide. The horse leaned into her touch. Charlie just stood there, gawking. "I'll be," he muttered. Alara led the filly back to the small pasture without a backward glance. Silas watched the whole thing. He had seen good horsemen in his time, men who prided themselves on their ability to break a wild spirit. But he had never seen anything like that. It wasn't about breaking. It was about understanding. It was a kind of strength he had not accounted for. A quiet competence that asked for no applause. He looked at the new plank he had just set. He looked at the long line of fence he had repaired. He had fixed things, tangible, physical things. But she had mended something wild and afraid without raising her voice. He began to see her not as the girl with the limp, but as the steady center of this failing place. While Abel grieved for what the ranch had been, and Charlie did the least he could to get by, Alara worked. She worked with a deliberate, focused energy that seemed to draw its power from the hard land itself. She met its indifference with her own quiet resolve. She did not complain about the wind or the clay or the leg that ached when the cold settled in. She simply did the next thing that needed doing. That evening at supper, the meal was quiet as usual. Cornbread, beans, and a little salt pork. Honest food. Abel was tired, his face drawn. Charlie ate quickly, eager to be done. Silas ate slowly, his gaze drifting to Alara. Color had come into her face from the day's work. A faint flush on her high cheekbones. Her hands, resting on the table, were never still for long, as if they were always contemplating the next task. "That was a good piece of work with the filly today," Silas said into the silence. The words felt loud in the small room. Charlie grunted, not looking up from his plate. Abel looked at his daughter with a familiar mix of pride and sorrow. Alara met Silas's gaze. Her gray eyes held his for a moment. There was no false modesty in them, just a simple direct acknowledgement. She was scared, she said, that was all. But in that moment Silas saw her. He saw past the limp, past the plain face and the worn dress. He saw the unyielding integrity that held her upright more surely than any sound leg could. He had thought he was stopping here for a bed and a wage. He was beginning to understand he was here for a lesson. A week turned into a month. Silas fixed the windmill. The slow, rhythmic creak of its turning blades became a new sound on the ranch, a sound of life. He and Alara worked together to re-shingle the barn roof, passing the shingles and hammers back and forth in a silent, efficient partnership. He learned the rhythm of her limp, the slight pause and drag, and found he could time his movements to it, so they worked as one. He learned her story in pieces, not from her but from Abel in the evenings when Alara was outside. A fall from a horse when she was a girl. A doctor who was drunk. A bone that set wrong. People see the leg, Abel said one night, his voice thick with a father's pain. They don't see the rest. They don't see that she's got more grit than any 10 men I've ever known. Silas already knew. He saw it every day. He saw it in the way she split firewood, using her weight and the swing of the axe to compensate for her leg. He saw it in the neat rows of her garden, a patch of defiant order against the wildness of the land. He saw it in her eyes, which missed nothing. One morning he was cleaning out the trough when he saw her struggling to lift a heavy sack of feed onto a high shelf in the barn. She had it halfway, her face tight with strain, her bad leg trembling. He started to move toward her to offer help. But he stopped. He saw the set of her jaw. This was a private battle. To interfere would be to insult her. She took a deep breath, shifted her grip, and with a final shuddering effort, heaved the sack onto the shelf. She stood there for a long moment, breathing heavily. Her hand pressed against the rough wood of the wall to steady herself. She did not know he was watching. In that quiet, solitary victory, Silas felt a profound and painful recognition. He knew what it was to fight a battle no one else could see. His was against the ghosts of a wife's laughter and a son's small hand in his. Hers was against the simple, brutal physics of a damaged body. They were both wounded. They were both still standing. He felt a shift inside him, something deep and tectonic. The thought of leaving, which had been a constant, low hum in the back of his mind, began to fade. The road no longer called to him. The motion he had craved now seemed like a hollow, pointless thing. What was out there but more wind and more dust and more silence? Here, there was a different kind of quiet. A quiet filled with the creak of the windmill, the lowing of cattle, and the steady, uneven footfalls of a woman who refused to be broken. One sweltering afternoon in July, a buggy kicked up a plume of red dust as it came down the road. Silas was repairing the corral gate, the one that had groaned on its hinges the day he arrived. He had taken it down and was methodically replacing the worn wood and rusted metal. He looked up, his hand shielding his eyes. The man driving the buggy was stout, dressed in a town suit that looked too hot for the weather. His face was fleshy and smug. Alara came to the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. A tension came into her posture that Silas had not seen before. "Barlow," she said, her voice flat. The man, Barlow, pulled the buggy to a stop and climbed down. He ignored Silas completely, his eyes fixed on Abel, who was coming slowly from the house. "Abel," Barlow said, his voice a little too loud, a little too friendly. "Just came to see if you'd reconsidered my offer. It's more than fair, more than this place is worth." "We're not selling, Mr. Barlow," Abel said, but his voice lacked conviction. He looked old and defeated. Barlow's gaze swept over the ranch and a flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He noticed the mended fence, the turning windmill, the new shingles on the barn. "Putting lipstick on a pig, Abel? It's still a pig. This land is drying up. You can't hold on forever." His eyes landed on Alara. A cruel smile touched his lips. "You should be thinking of your girl. What's to become of her? No man's going to take on a cripple and a failing ranch." The word hung in the hot, still air. Cripple. Silas saw Alara flinch, a barely perceptible tightening of her shoulders. Her face went pale, but her expression remained a mask of stone. She did not look away from Barlow. Her chin was lifted. It was an act of defiance so quiet it was almost invisible. But Silas saw it. Abel sputtered, a weak protest dying on his lips. Silas put down his hammer. He walked, not fast, but with a deliberate weight to his steps, from the corral to the space between Barlow and the porch. He stopped beside Alara. He did not look at her, but he could feel the rigid stillness of her. He was close enough that his sleeve brushed her arm. He turned his gaze on Barlow. His eyes were cold and flat as river stones. "The word you're looking for," Silas said, his voice low and even, "is capable." Barlow was taken aback. He finally seemed to register Silas's presence. He looked him up and down, taking in the worn clothes, the lean, hard frame, and the gun belt that Silas wore more out of habit than intention. "And who are you?" Barlow sneered. "The new hired hand." "I am," Silas said. "And I can tell you this, that woman." He nodded slightly toward Alara, without taking his eyes off Barlow. "Outworks any 2 men you could hire. She's mended every piece of harness in that barn. She's gentled horses you'd run from. She pulled a calf born backwards last month while her father and I were on the north pasture. She did it alone." He took a step closer to Barlow. The speculator's smug confidence began to waver. This ranch is not failing, Silas continued, his voice like the scrape of rock on rock. It's being rebuilt by her father, and by me. So you can take your offer and your insults and you can drive them right back to town. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply stated facts. He laid the truth of Alara's character out like a carpenter laying a plumb line. It was straight. It was undeniable. Barlow's face flushed a dark red. He was a man used to bullying the weak and getting his way through bluster. He had no answer for this kind of quiet, unshakable certainty. He looked from Silas's cold eyes to Alara's steady, defiant face. He saw an alliance he had not anticipated, a strength he could not measure in dollars. He opened his mouth, then closed it. With a wordless grunt of fury, he turned, heaved himself back into his buggy, and cracked the whip over his horse. The buggy rattled away, leaving a cloud of angry red dust to settle in its wake. The silence that followed was profound. The only sound was the steady creak of the windmill Silas had fixed. Abel let out a long, shaky breath. "Thank you, Silas," he whispered. Silas didn't answer. He turned to Alara. She was still looking down the road where Barlow had disappeared. The rigid tension in her shoulders had eased. Color was slowly returning to her face, like a lamp being turned up. She finally turned her head and looked at him. Her gray eyes were clear, and for the first time, he saw something in them beyond mere assessment. He saw a flicker of gratitude, so deep and raw it was like looking into a clear well. She had been seen, she had been defended, not with pity, but with respect, with the truth. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was more than enough. He nodded back. He turned without another word, picked up his hammer, and went back to fixing the gate. The work felt different now. It was no longer just a job. It was a defense. It was a declaration. Every nail he drove was a statement. This is a place worth saving. This is a woman worth fighting for. The days that followed the confrontation with Barlow were different. A subtle shift had occurred, a realignment of the quiet spaces between them. The work continued, hard and demanding as ever, but it was now underpinned by a shared understanding. When Silas and Alara worked together, their movements were even more synchronized, their silence more comfortable. It was the quiet of partners, not of strangers. He started leaving a cup of coffee for her on the porch rail in the mornings, just the way she liked it. She took to mending his shirts, leaving them folded neatly on his bunk, the tiers stitched with the same care she gave her harnesses. These were the small, unspoken currencies of their growing connection. They were practical acts of care, more honest than any flowery words could be. One evening in late summer, a storm rolled in from the mountains. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind tore through the valley. They worked together to secure the livestock, their movements urgent in the fading light. The first drops of rain, fat and cold, began to fall as they ran for the house. They ate supper to the sound of rain drumming on the roof and wind rattling the window panes. Abel went to bed early, the storm seeming to seep into his old bones. Silas and Alara sat at the table, the lantern casting a warm, flickering glow. "My wife, Sarah," Silas said suddenly into the quiet. The name felt strange on his tongue. He had not said it aloud to another soul in 5 years. Alara looked at him, her hands still around her empty cup. She did not speak, she just listened. "She loved storms," he said, his voice quiet. She said it was the one time the sky felt as loud as she did. He managed a small, sad smile. "We had a son, Thomas." He had her eyes. He stopped. The story was there, a hard knot in his chest. The fever that took them both in the space of a week. The silence that followed. The endless, empty road. He did not need to say the words. She could see it in his face. She reached across the table and for the first time touched him. Her fingers rested lightly on the back of his hand. Her touch was not one of pity. It was one of understanding. A simple, profound acknowledgement of his pain. "My mother died when I was born," she said, her voice just as quiet. "My father, he tries, but he mostly sees what he lost when he looks at me." She paused, her gaze dropping to the table. And then the fall. After that, most people only ever saw the leg. She looked up and her eyes met his across the lantern light. "You didn't," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. "I saw you gentle a spooked horse," he said. "I saw you lift a sack of feed you had no business lifting. I saw you work from sunup to sundown without a word of complaint. I saw the work. Grief doesn't leave. It just learns to share the house." In that small kitchen, with the storm raging outside, two solitary griefs found a quiet corner to sit together. They were not diminished, but they were no longer alone. The seasons turned. The heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden days of autumn. The ranch was breathing again. The fences were strong, the barn was sound, and the cattle were fat. Abel seemed to have found a new spark, his steps a little less shuffling, his eyes a little brighter. He had started to talk about the future, about buying a new bull, about planting a larger hay field. Silas had found a kind of peace he thought he had lost forever. The ghosts were still there, but they were quieter now. Their whispers were often drowned out by the creak of the windmill, the ring of his hammer on steel, the steady, uneven rhythm of Elara's walk. He had stopped thinking about the road, this place, this work, this quiet woman. They had become his compass points. He had found a place to stop. One afternoon, he and Elara were standing on the small rise behind the house, looking out over the valley. The aspens on the mountainside had turned a brilliant shimmering gold. The air was clean and sharp. They had spent the day clearing rocks from a new pasture, and their bodies were tired in that deep, satisfying way that only comes from hard, honest labor. He looked at the ranch spread out below them. He saw the neat lines of the fences he had built. He saw the solid roof of the barn he had repaired. He saw the wisp of smoke rising from the chimney of the house. It was not just a place of employment anymore. It was a place he had helped to heal, a place he had poured his own sweat and strength into. It felt like his. He looked at Elara. She was gazing at the mountains, a small, thoughtful line between her brows. The wind pressed her simple dress against her, revealing the strong, capable lines of her body. He saw not a woman with a limp, but a woman as steadfast and enduring as the land itself. The decision settled in him, not with a crash, but with a quiet, solid certainty. It was the most honest thought he'd had in years. "Elara," he said. She turned to him. The afternoon sun caught the gold in her hair. He was not a man for fancy words. His life had been lived in actions, not speeches. He would give her the only thing he had to offer, the plain, unvarnished truth. "I've been a wanderer for a long time," he began, his voice steady, "moving from one place to the next, never staying. I think I was looking for something I thought I'd lost for good." He gestured out at the valley, at the ranch they had rebuilt together. "This place needs a full-time man. Your father is getting older. The work is only going to get harder." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "And I need a place to stop wandering. I need a place to put down roots." He met her clear gray eyes. "We work well together," he said. "We understand each other without needing a lot of words. I was thinking we could make this partnership a permanent one." It was not a declaration of love in the way the poets wrote about it. There were no promises of moonbeams or roses. It was a proposal built of fence posts and shored-up foundations. It was an offer of shared work, of mutual respect, of a quiet life built with steady hands. It was in its own way the most profound declaration of love he was capable of making. She did not answer right away. She looked at him, her taking stock eyes searching his face. She was assessing the offer, weighing its truth, just as she would assess the weather or the health of a calf. He stood perfectly still and let her look. He had laid his truth before her, and the choice was hers. Finally, a small, slow smile touched her lips. It was the first time he had ever seen her truly smile, and it transformed her face, lighting it from within. "Yes," she said. Her voice was quiet but firm. "I'd want that, Silas." 2 years passed. The ranch thrived. The new bull Silas had bought brought strong calves. The expanded hayfield yielded a rich crop. A new section was added to the house, the timber cut and milled by Silas himself. The sound of a child's laughter now echoed in the valley. A little girl with Silas's dark hair and Elara's steady gray eyes. One evening, as the sun set and painted the mountains in hues of orange and purple, Silas and Elara stood on the same rise behind the house. He stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, her back resting against his chest. Their daughter played nearby, chasing grasshoppers in the fading light. They were quiet for a long time, watching the land that was theirs. The fences were straight and true. The cattle were moving slowly toward the barn. The windmill turned in the gentle breeze, its familiar creak a comforting song. They had built this together. Elara leaned her head back against his shoulder. Her limp was more pronounced now that she was often tired from chasing their child, but it was just a part of the rhythm of their life. Silas no longer even noticed it. He only noticed the strength in the woman who stood before him, the steady beat of her heart against his hands. "Do you remember the day Barlow came?" she asked softly. "I remember," he said. "No one had ever stood up for me like that," she said. "Not with anger, just with the truth." "It was the only thing to do," he said simply. She turned in his arms to face him. She laid a hand on his weathered cheek. "You saw me, Silas," she whispered. "When no one else did, you saw me." He covered her hand with his own. He had come to this place a hollow man, a ghost drifting through his own life. He had been looking for a place to stop, but he had found something more. He had found a home. He had found a reason. The greatest things are not found in the noise, but in the quiet. They are built not with grand gestures, but with the steady accumulation of small, honest acts, a mended fence, a shared meal, a quiet defense of a person's true worth. There is a kind of love that does not need to be declared in loud proclamations. It is a practical, durable thing, forged in the crucible of shared work and mutual respect. It is the love that sees the capability, not the flaw, the strength, not the wound. For the hardest thing in this world is not to find a place to live, but to find the person who sees you, truly sees you, and in their eyes, you finally find a place to stop running.